Like we're streaming.
We are. We
Okay.
are live on Facebook and live on Zoom, virtual everywhere. Thank you
Okay.
all so much for joining us. Sorry for the late start. Like I said, I'm so glad that this is a happy hour. Yeah, cheers.
Well, good
And
for you guys.
Dennis, I am going to make you a host one more time, and then I'm just going to let you take it away.
Okay.
There you go.
All right, everybody. Thanks for being here today. I'm Dennis Swibold. For those of you who I haven't met, and I know quite a few of you or have heard of you, so it's nice to be here today. As I was telling others, I'd hoped to be out on my deck doing this, but the neighbors were just too noisy, and there's an ice cream truck going around the neighborhood too many times. So this might be the best, safest place for me to be talking about this. But I've been talking about this topic for Humanities Montana for more than 2.5 years, I think, traveling around the state. And the overall title has been What's Happening to the News, although there have been variations on the theme from time to time. I've talked a lot about the history of news, the technology, the economics of it, all that kind of stuff. But lately, I've been focusing more and more on misinformation and how to deal with stuff that's just bad, how to know if what you're getting is trustworthy, what kind of strategies can you employ, what kind of resources can you use, how can you make yourself a better consumer of information. So that's what I'll probably be talking about most today. And I know that there's some people in the group here that have got great ideas and are followers of the news. So I'd love to hear your questions. I think we've had a few submitted already that looked pretty good. So I'm anxious to talk about what you want to talk about. I've got a slideshow that I'll share with you here. It's pretty short, and I don't mind interrupting it at any point. Deal with questions that you might have. So if Sam or somebody wants to kind of monitor the chat room, that would be kind of helpful as I run the show. And if you see urgent sort of questions that people are asking that are fitting with what we're talking about right then, don't be shy, interrupt me, and I'll see what I can do to help people understand or at least tell you what I'm in. I'll only give you one more disclaimer before we start, and it's that I'm not a doctor and I don't play one on TV, and I didn't sleep in a Holiday Inn last night. So when it comes to health information about COVID, I'm going to send you to people I think are authoritative, although that's a subject all by itself. Who's authoritative in these times when there's so much mixed information and so much sort of confusion about what the message it is and who ought to be delivering it. So that's something we might want to get into as well. But we'll talk about some strategies that other people were using, but we'll talk a lot today about facts. One of the things I've been talking today, I just want to give you a little bit of history about sort of where we've been. And as I was talking with one of your participants earlier, you know, when we look at the changes in the news and we try to remember what's happening today, I like to use the analogy of there used to be sort of fountains that were rare and spread across the country. We could go to get water, and by water I mean information. And now it's like drinking out of a fire hydrant. You're getting so much information so fast from so many places. It's hard to make sense of it all. It's hard to know what to trust too, because so many of the information sources can be bad. They can be misinformation. It can be outright bad actor disinformation, stuff that's knowingly and unwittingly wrong. Both of those things competing for your attention. So the internet has although it promises us all sorts of wonderful things and makes life easier in so many ways, it also has some downsides in the fact that everybody does have a voice. That doesn't mean it's worth listening to or it's very credible at times. So that's the dilemma we all find ourselves in. It's an old problem, essentially. I used to like to show a slide that showed representatives from the US and England shaking hands over the Atlantic Ocean to show what it meant to have the transatlantic cable, when you finally had the telegraph allowing people to talk across the world. And pundits of the day, and this is the 1850s, says it's going to be too too fast, too speedy for the truth. We won't have enough time to let information soak in and analyze and judge it. It's almost laughable to think about that right now because we're getting information in split seconds. And sometimes it's contradicted in split seconds too. So all of that is made it really difficult for us to keep up the news. The job for a consumer is just incredibly hard right now. Where do you go? What do you trust? Which ones do you look at? I'm a news junkie, and frankly, some days if I go down every rabbit hole, I'm just as crazy as can be by the time I get done. So I think I do what a lot of people do. I find sources that I trust. I find sources that have been truthful over time. That doesn't mean they won't make mistakes. That won't mean they won't get it wrong sometimes. But some of the other parts of my calculation are who admits their mistakes. That's one of the things I tell people to look for if they're thinking about who they should trust. Who admits their mistakes and who doesn't make them routinely. And that gives you the kind of trust. And you know that's the way it is with your own personal dealings with people too. But misinformation and bad information is just spread. It's been there before, forever, but now it's just exponentially greater. And that's the problem. It's automated too now, which is another problem too. So you can have bad actors putting out bots that are spreading messages and information in very different and contradictory and confusing sort of ways. And if you just look at the news of this week, it has been a terribly confusing week. In some ways, we've been inspired, we've been dismayed, you've taken from one emotional spectrum to the other. I can't remember too many weeks in my news life that has been as crazy as this one, as chaotic at times. And a lot of misinformation has been coming from just about all sorts of sources. There's been a lot of information about COVID over time since we came to grips with it that has been pretty interesting. There was a piece done in April by the NewsHour that was pretty good. It seems like years ago that when we first started dealing with this because the time has been compressed so well. But I remember claims that eating garlic would cure COVID-19. You probably remember those. Microwave your mail. Those were some of the claims. One of the most ridiculous ones I saw was using a hair dryer and blowing it in your face was going to be able to cure you somehow of COVID virus. And then there were ones that were more insidious, but have been debunked nonetheless, that the coronavirus was a weaponized vaccine by a foreign government, that Bill Gates created it so that he could put chips in us and monitor our every move. Then it was 5G, that was the culprit, and people across the country were burning 5G towers, especially in England, and even Boris Johnson's staff had to say that was complete rubbish, and I think those were their exact words as they talked about what was going on there. So there's so much information that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And we see those things. A lot of that stuff was the easy stuff. It was the stuff that was very easy to check with people who know basic sorts of things. But there's so much that we don't know about coronavirus, and that's what's made it difficult for us to follow. It's what made it difficult for epidemic people who study epidemics to kind of understand too. But after the H1N1 controversy or problem, and it was scary a few years ago, people were asking themselves, how do we prepare for this? And it isn't like we didn't have warning, and it isn't like we didn't have good, thoughtful writers and researchers telling us that this is a possibility that could happen. It's been out there on the landscape for a long time, but it seemed inconceivable, I think, to happen on such a scale that a lot of people thought, well, it might happen, but we'll trust a handful of experts to take care of that. Well, when H1N1 happened, a handful of experts did, and that was the Epidemic Intelligence Service as part of the CDC. And what they did was put together a book, and their thought behind it was, this is going to be as much a fight about message as it is about the science. because we may know the science, we may understand it or may not know about it, but how do we communicate what we do know and what we don't know in a way that gives people confidence that they're taking the right moves, that they can be prepared to make themselves as safe as possible. And that's been one of the most frustrating parts, I think, about this whole story as someone who watches it from abroad. And that's a lot of journalists, I think, are saying this, but a lot of health officials are saying this. A lot of people in public life are saying this. WHO called it an infodemic early on, and I think that's true. Snopes.com, I don't know if you know the fact-checking site Snopes, but if you don't, I'd encourage you to get on there. And they're a group of people who fact-check the most outrageous sorts of claims they get about current events, but also about pop culture. And they're a beleaguered bunch of people right now. They are swamped by all the different fact-check requests that they're getting. But I saw an interview with just last week with one of the Snopes editors saying that the dumbest comment she received was, if you stick a blow dryer in your face, that'll solve it. We talked about that one, but she also said she heard someone say tonic water was a cure. And she said, no, it's good for gin and tonics, but it wasn't a cure for COVID-19. So a lot of the fact checkers have been out there doing as best they can, trying to keep up with this crisis. And that's what I've been trying to encourage people to learn how to do. I do a fact check game show for prospective students and high school students who come to the school, and we recruit. And I tell them to look at PolitiFact. It's a fact-checking site that was started by the Poynter Institute, which is kind of a think tank and educational resource for journalists nationwide. It's nonprofit, nonpartisan foundation, and it's got some of the best information out there. It has its own COVID-19 database of fact checks, and there must be 5,000 to 6,000 different items that it has fact checked about that. And I think you'd want to look at that too. Factcheck.org is another one started by Annenberg at USC that you ought to take a look at. Snopes, obviously, I think they're still there, although it's facing financial difficulties sometimes too. Remember that when you talk about supporting journalism, that these fact checkers are journalists too, and they need your support, especially right now, because it's a difficult time and they're being swamped with these things. There's a new one I like, and it's aimed at high school students, and it's called MediaWise. And it's a joint venture of the Stanford History Educational Group, which has done a lot of research about media literacy over time, and has put together a really good selection of free curriculum information for teachers at middle school and high school levels. Stuff that's for beginners, stuff that's for more advanced people on some of the questions that they hope people are asking. And MediaWise is all based on Instagram, because that's where most high school kids are. They're not, Facebook is for your folks, right? Instagram is probably where we can live in a different sort of freer sort of way. But Instagram offered up this help from Poynter, from the Stanford History Group, from Google. Got involved and gave them a bunch of money too. So they put this curriculum together, and MediaWise sends these fact checks to high school students, and with help from the pros working in the fact check world, they're able to come up with fact check stories. And the one I saw that really caught my eye was this week, when there was a TikTok, and I don't know if you know much about TikTok. They're these short little funny, mostly videos that are going out there, but some of them are pretty serious. And there was one that said COVID-19 testing centers were being closed to punish anti-racist protesters. So in other words, if you were protesting the George Floyd situation, if you're protesting the racism you saw in society right now, you couldn't get the testing that you really need. It's a pretty harrowing sort of claim to make, and MediaWise students jumped on it really quickly. And they used a process that I think I'll try to acquaint you with, called lateral reading, where they went and looked at a lot of different sources about that to see if that was true. And it turned out to be not true at all, not legit. And I really appreciate, I would love to be able to show you that video of that student making that fact check, because they do it so smartly. And they also, in doing that, tell you main things that the civic online reasoning, which is the curriculum I'm talking about. I hope all of you can get access to COR.org will probably get you there. Civic online reasoning. And they just have 3 simple points. And they ask people to check when they see information, who's behind this information? Where's it coming from? If you see a sponsored ad on a news site, that you know that they bought that ad. You know that they have something that they wish to receive in return from that. That's a motivation they might have. And that doesn't mean their information is bad, but it does mean you ought to be skeptical about what their end result is. Are they selling you something that you may not want or don't agree with? That may lower the trustworthiness of that information too. So that's something you need to know. Where is this stuff coming from? And then they have, what's the evidence? You know, how many of these news sources that bring you fake news cite sources, citing evidence? I was looking at a online news operation from, I think, Eastern Montana, and it was very new. It wasn't really done by journalists, hadn't had a reputation as being a news source. It came out of the evangelical right, and it was talking about, had a lot of stories on there, and they would always start with, although we have no evidence, or we cannot cite evidence. Those would be the first phrases of the sentences. And I was actually glad to see that, because it told me right away, it gave me the clue that I needed, that there's not much evidence behind this to back that up. So if you're reading laterally, like a fact checker does, you're skipping through to find valid sources quickly. And ones that are citing things without evidence are kind of much lower in the hierarchy of what's trustworthy out there. So that's something you want to know. And the third thing they want you to look at is, who else is saying this? Can you find a verification online? Can you find a verification for people you can trust? Sources that have a long reputation for hiring people to actually check facts, who have some stake in credibility for getting information right. Those 3 things put together can get you through a lot of the questions that you might have. It takes some time. It takes some practice. This reading laterally is very different from what most of us do when we look at a website. We look at it, we look at the title, we look at everything. If it looks professional, that might make us think it's good. If it has some nice sort of words about why they want to do it, and that sounds kind of reasonable, that might make us think so. But professional fact checkers would zip by that stuff so fast and not even spend any time with it. And look for evidence, look for trusted people who have done this kind of information before. And that's where they're going to go. You know, one of the things that's really made it difficult right now when you're talking about COVID-19 is that much of the basic message, the strategy that communicators came up with after the H1N1 virus was that we're going to have a common voice. We're going to let scientists talk about what they know and what they don't know. And if you've been listening to some of the health professionals like Dr. Fauci, you hear him go through these checklists from that pandemic communication stuff all the time. He starts out with empathy for people, but then he tells them, here's what we can know and here's what we can't know. This is changing. We don't know exactly how it affects different people in different circumstances and all the mutations. We don't have a cure yet. We don't have those kind of things. So there's that uncertainty that scientists are kind of comfortable with, I guess. They have to be, because they're always in a process of discovery, and there's a constant battle between regimens and experimentations and theories to figure this kind of out. But for the general public, we're not that comfortable with uncertainty. It scares us, and for good reason. I understand that. We want to know slick, correct kind of answers, but there are certain circumstances where that's just hard to find. And so the best you can hope for then is to have people tell you what they know and what they don't know, and to err on the side of caution when they're giving you advice and what you should do. So some of those meetings in the White House where they would talk and then the president would contradict them, and then you had this awkwardness going on the screen. I think that really undermined a lot of confidence people might have who are looking for answers. How do we deal with this? How do we struggle with this safely? How can we keep ourselves safe and not have our economy go down the tubes? Those are the questions that we're all asking, and it hasn't been helped at all by kind of an uncertain, I believe, contradictory, confused message from the leaders at the top. Leadership is important, and you have to have it on this in this message. And I think the scientists are the people you should talk to or hear from. Now, does that mean that they're always right? No, it doesn't. And one of you had a question, I think, that Sam shared with me early on. It says, what if you distrust the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control? Who else can you look to for information? And it's a great question, and I gotta tell you, it's one that sent me spinning for a while, because where are you going to go to get trustworthy information for an entire nation on something, unless you go to the institutions that are responsible and have people who study to do that sort of thing. So I think in the end, you sort of have to go to those institutions. Do they get it right all the time? No, they don't. The CDC has come under some pretty harsh criticism. Just this week, the New York Times had launched a major investigation, or unveiled a major investigation that showed all the problems that they had, sort of moving quickly enough and getting through the bureaucracy to get things ready. I think they had a core of epidemiologists who understood what the things were going to be, but they were also confused by just the bureaucracy of how much effort is it going to take to get all these supplies, to make people safe, to get all the equipment that we're going to have for hospitals. How could you do it on this scale when you've never done it before? And then when you are getting mixed messages from your leaders about whether you should even be thinking about that or doing that, it sort of made that job even tougher. So I think you can't throw them out. You can't say that they're not sources you can turn to, but you have to understand what they can tell you and what they can't tell you. There are other health care institutions that are searching this. Look for ones with histories. Look for Johns Hopkins. They've been doing a great job in looking at this kind of stuff, but these people may get it wrong at sometimes too. The question is, are they willing to tell you when they get it wrong? Are they willing to correct mistakes? Are they willing to say that even in this time of uncertainty, we're going to give you information that doesn't quite make sense? Sometimes we're going to err on the side of caution. Do you remember all the discussion about whether you should wear masks or not? And whether they protected you or whether they were to protect somebody else, and waiting for sort of an official word on how that was going to work? Well, it changed, and it would change as scientists learn more about how the virus spread and so forth. So those are all things I think I don't know if that's a good answer, but Sam's got a question.
Is that what you're referring to, Kim, the controversy over the cotton op-ed piece in the chat there? Or was that another New York Times controversy?
That's another controversy that maybe Dennis does or does not want to get into at some point.
Well, I'd be glad to. And the question is whether the media itself should allow or feature or disseminate viewpoints that they might not agree with. And that's a tough one, I think, in this particular case. We're dealing with very important kind of issues. We're dealing with, in some cases, life and death situations. You want to be extremely careful that you don't pour gasoline on the situation. You don't make things worse than they particularly are. And I think that and Tom Cotton was talking about militarizing the response in all these states, and they're dealing with what I believe are largely peaceful protests with elements of violent, anarchic sort of behavior going on too, that might be overkill. And the staff at the New York Times was protesting that, saying you can't be giving that kind of message. And I think it came out today with a mea culpa of sorts. Perhaps it shouldn't have run that. But I also believe in a diversity of views and a discussion. And those are kind of the most difficult questions, I think, for journalists to handle. Somebody also had a question about the media's coverage of Trump's tweets and how much time it should spend covering those. And boy, what a great question that is, because this debate is going on not just on behind the scenes. If you go to media industry websites, any one of you can look and see this debate happening in real time among journalists and people in the industry and people not in the industry. How much of this do we pay attention to? And it's a difficult question because, you know, throughout much of American history, when figures of authority were scarce, you really tended to put your faith in the leaders to tell them what was going on. Some of you might remember, I doubt anybody here has heard FDR give a fireside chat during the Depression, but that was comforting to a lot of people. He could tell you what they were planning. He could tell you we're not alone. He could tell you that we need to unite, that we're going to get through this thing together. And those were kind of comforting words. And that was a crisis period in American history that we were able to kind of get through one way or the other. So I think, you know, those kind of sources of authority have been really important. But what presidents say especially is important too. I mean, you know, leaders all over the world look at every single word that the president of the most powerful nation on earth utters, and they weigh it to see what it matters, what's true, how it might affect them, what can they speculate based on those things, how can they position themselves, what policies should they come up, what policies is he going to come up with. So all those things get magnified when the president issues those kind of things. What's unusual is that now we get those things all the time, and you get them in the middle of the night, and you get them at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. You get these kind of pronouncements that don't look like they have been vetted by anybody, that don't look like they have been discussed in terms of what the policy or a policy or any policy might be in those kind of cases. So it led a lot of people to say, I'll just turn them off. And Twitter has made some attempts to not turn them off, but has made some attempts to put some fact-checking labels up on some of Trump's tweets saying, you know, you might want to look at this. You might want to check this otherwhere. Or we found through other sources that this may not be true. And those kind of things the president took great umbrage to. But I think Twitter was well within its rights to do that. It's a private platform. It can say it's a publisher in that respect, even though it doesn't like to use that language, but it can decide what information it puts out there, what information it doesn't. It's very difficult, I think, for the public to know that. But I think journalists have to watch the president's tweets, have to listen to the president's tweets, but I think they have to be judicious too. They have to talk about them when they're actually going to make changes that people will see and they will feel, or if they encourage things that might be scary. You know, when Trump was telling the governors of the states to open up, or it's in your hands, you make that decision. You listen to your health care experts and you make that kind of decision. And at the same time, tweeting that we needed to liberate Michigan or liberate these other kind of states, putting the pressure on them at the same time. Well, that's an incredible bind for those people to be in. How do you make a good choice under those cases? I think the American public needs to see both sides of that discussion. So I think to some extent, you're going to have to see those tweets if you care, if you want to make up your mind. They're going to change the way you think about things. You're going to see what you think is fair and smart and just. And that's what information is supposed to do in a democracy. You ought to be wrestling with those kinds of things. It may not be fun to see. It may not be comforting to see. It may be frightening at times to see that. But that's all a part of the calculus that every individual makes when they go and pick up a ballot and go to a voting booth. And one of the media's jobs, I think, and I even hate the term media because everybody talks about it as if it's a monolith. And of course we know it isn't. There's so many different factions and varieties of media out there that it's difficult for it to talk about that. But the journalism, I think, that matters most, the journalism that I've always been most comfortable promoting at every level, at national level and especially at the local level, is accountability. What are people doing? How can you believe that to be true? Is that a smart way to be spending our money? Did people know about this decision in advance? Those are all questions people want to know if they're looking at how our government works or how it operates. And who's going to tell you otherwise with any sorts of credibility? Who's going to tell you who gets paid to sort of fact check and verify? Are they going to make mistakes? You bet they are. They're human beings, and any human enterprise is flawed. I got to tell you from the start, naturally. But you want people indoctrinated in an ethic of verification. That's so important. And the difficulty of this particular time is that more of that responsibility, I think, is being shared with the public too. You have to take on that skepticism, that mindset that says, is this true? How do we know this is true? Who's saying that? What evidence do they have? What are other people saying? Those basic sort of questions that Civic Online Reasoning program was asking people to think about. That's just another way to say critical thinking. And that's so important that people sort of understand that and that it be taught, I think. Other questions? Yeah.
So you talked a lot about news sources that are accountable and that question themselves and are willing to admit their mistakes. And I'm also in that camp. You know, you have to seek out those types of news sources. But what do you say to the people who deliberately do not put any stake in that? Deliberately do not really care about that? And I'm not going to go too far with this, but I would say that encompasses a lot of people, and they do it in a way that is very deliberately not vetted in order to create an effect. So what do you say to those people?
I think you have to have a pretty good news diet. I really think that's an important part of this whole critical thinking, media literacy equation. You can't be getting your news from just one place. You really can't. You have to, if you want to triangulate, you want to see what other people are saying, you're going to have a news environment that takes you around the different kind of spheres of influence. And look and say, who's giving me this information? Are they a news organization that's already tied and committed to a political point of view? If that's the case, you have to consider that in your calculation. Is it the political point of view drive the news that they choose? Does it sway the news that they choose? Does it slant the news that they choose? It can. And I think you ought to look at that. I got to tell you, there was a time on Monday or Tuesday when I looked at CNN and I looked at Fox News, and I thought, these are two different worlds we live in. These are two different nations that we live in some ways. And that's not new. That's been around for quite a while now. It's been around for many years. And so, there's a cartoon I like to show, and I would have showed you in this screen show, where you have this high school or elementary school teacher asking her class who started the Civil War, and this kid raises his hand and he says, CNBC and MSNBC and Fox News started the Civil War. And I think that's obviously a satirical analogy to show how polarized we are in our politics to some extent. You have, even going back to the question about, should you trust the CDC anymore? I thought, that's a great question. That's such a great question. It sent me to Google, and I was looking up questions, and I said, who's doing any polls on that? Do Americans trust the Centers for Disease Control? And not as much as they used to. And I think that's true. And it's a combination of their mistakes. It's a combination of their lack of resources and preparation. It's a combination of the confusion that they're experiencing from the political leadership above them. But even with that, I found that most Americans trusted them more than they did the President of the United States. And that's an amazing thing. It split along predictably partisan lines. More Republicans tended to believe the president than the CDC. But when you looked at the entire country that was polled, then I think it was probably a reasonable snapshot of where people were. It wasn't an incredibly large margin more than the president, but it was still a margin that was ahead of it.
Dennis, Maureen Byrne here.
Oh, yeah.
Live in Denver, very involved in following the protests that are occurring here.
Mm-hmm.
What do you tell your students when there's such pressure to get things online immediately? And how often are you telling them update that information? How do you know how often to get that information changed?
Well, that's one of the obligations of online journalism. There's the story cycle just doesn't exist anymore. And I remember I could write a story and I had 24 hours before something would happen, and I might need to update it the next day or correct it or do whatever information change I'll make. But you're right, it happens so quickly that I think students are a lot more sort of comfortable with that scale and that speed of information. I watch students on their phones and I see them make so many decisions on social media so fast. It just boggles my mind sometimes. How can they make a decision about whether that's good or they want to share? But I think that's part of what we have to teach in the journalism school, and we do. How do you know that that's true? All those questions that we talked about and that involve critical thinking are questions they have to answer. And they may not know all the answers, and they may not be able to tell you all the answers. But here's something I'm seeing news organizations do more and more, and I think it's really important in this day of social media, and that's transparency. Where did you get your information from? A link to it. Show me. How do I know? If I don't trust you, I ought to be able to look at where you get that kind of stuff. And I think the act of having to show people where you get your information is really important thing for media to do. I think we've always thought they would trust us to know, or we'd put it in the attribution of stories and that was good enough, but I don't think so anymore. I don't believe that. I think you have to be work a lot harder at being transparent about where you get for information. So that's what we talk about a lot. And here's another thing I hear them saying as a result of this pressure or this move to transparency, and that is, here's what we know and here's what we don't know. That's a humble state of mind if you think about it. And an editor once said a long time ago that one purpose of an education ought to make us humble about what we don't know. And I think that's the truth. I mean, you get a question and you don't spend some time chasing it down across a lot of places and lateral reading, you're not being very humble. You're thinking that you know it all. You're thinking that I'm the authority, I'm the press, I can do these kind of things and people have to listen to me. I don't think that's necessarily true. They're going to want to hear where you know that, how you know that, and then they may be checking to see if anybody else is reporting similar kind of information and what those sources are. For that kind of stuff too. So I think that's a great question, and I thank you for it. But it's awfully important. If I could, there was a study that came out. The study of how to fake news is fascinating. The research is fascinating because it's so counterintuitive and contradictory. Just the fact that you talk about fake news is something journalists have to be careful about. I was afraid to almost tell you that tonic water could cure COVID-19 because somebody might take that seriously. That's where we are today. Every time journalists talk about fake news, there's research to show that piece of fake news gets amplified and goes more viral and people pick it up and send it other kinds of places. So, we used to talk about how to make a correction in newspaper days. We would say, don't repeat the error. Well, it's hard to correct things that are wrong online without at least referring to them or showing them. So that has its own built-in sort of backlash and booby trap about that. So there's also some reason to believe that if a claim or something, a fact that came from the media has been really criticized by partisan sites that you like, it just gave it more credibility. It just gave your claim, your side, more credibility because there's so much distrust of information or mistrust of authority, of institutions right now. And I think that springs from a lot of the different cultural and technological things that we're seeing going on in the media and in public life, and how government works too. So those are questions that I think are really important too.
I have a question. Thank you for your remarks. I have a question about it's been a slow seepage, right? But I remember a time when the news, they interviewed experts, and they were people in the field, they were people in academia, whatever, right? They were Dr. Fauci. And I feel like so much of the news that my students I teach at Carroll College consume are, let's interview this celebrity or that celebrity about it, right? I mean, when did this shift happen? Why do you think it happened? Because I mean, I just spend a lot of time disabusing them, which, you know, or abusing them maybe. But right, I mean, I think it's a really important thing to think about is that it's not just chasing down the facts. It's some of these news sources, who are they asking to weigh in?
Right. Who's behind the information, right? It's that first question of civics,
I mean,
civic
that's
reasoning,
nuts.
critical thinking. And if it's, you know, if it's somebody giving you advice, you're going to have Dr. Fauci, or you're going to have your car mechanic, or you're going to have somebody who's a great dancer and singer. I mean, what expertise do they have for that thing? But I think
a lot of power.
it's true because they have massive audiences. And when you have massive audiences, you suddenly think people want to talk to you all the time. They want your opinion, which means that you know so much that they want to hear from you. And that gives you kind of a blown up authority on subjects that you have nothing to do with, or know that little bit. And there are media organizations that love that dynamic. There are, you know, TMZ. You look at some of well, it's kind of like the National Enquirer online, but they've always kind of feed on rumor and celebrity, and that's been a pretty profitable mixture. If you can mix news with entertainment, infotainment, they've called it for years, it's a powerful way to kind of make money and build large audiences. And if you can build large audience, you can sell those collections of eyeballs to advertisers. That's kind of the game that's going on there. So you have to understand motivations. You have to understand different media groups' motivations. Are they there to make money out of it? I was going to show you a bunch of tweets and things like that in my slideshow, that, and maybe I'll share it with Sam and make sure she gets it. She can send a copy to everybody so that you can look through it too. But there's, you know, there's some that just come from people who just don't know what they're doing on. They're great examples of exactly the kind of things that you're talking about. Don't really have much ability to speak about the topic, but they have huge audiences, and there are people asking them about that. Who do they know who's famous? Who do they know who gets around the world in jet sets? Who do they know? What views do they have on things? And I think if you're young, that can be kind of an attractive way to go. I mean, I had my heroes when I was 16, 14 years old, people I looked up to that I probably gave way too much credence to, rock and roll stars that, lived life. They're probably not even alive today, so it's nothing new, I think. But again, magnitude, speed, and scope, these things can build viral kind of audiences. So going back to that basic sort of thing, who's giving you that information is really important. What credibility do they really have on that subject? That's an awfully important one for people to ask. Yeah, is this Moraine? Somebody else has a question? Oh, Carrie, do you have a question?
No, I just had a comment on that. The other day, flipping through, watching Fox News, Archbishop Anthony Dolan on Fox News talking about the opening of baseball season. You know, the churches had then opened, and now possibly going on and opening baseball season in New York, and what a great fan he was. And I couldn't see where that he had the authority or information to talk about opening baseball season.
Well, he's not the authority for that kind of information. That's the blunt answer. And if you listen, the authorities, the medical information experts are telling you, open up. You can do that at your peril. There are going to be spikes. There's going to be resurgence, and we're seeing that. We're seeing some of the biggest days of new coronavirus cases in some parts of the country than ever. And that's not going to wind down for a while. These protests are scary that way. One of the stories that I think that's getting a lot of attention from the Pointers coronavirus side is how do you make a mass protest safe? And what effect does tear gas have on that? And all these other kinds of questions you can't even imagine, of what's going on. But when people get back together, they're going to spread this thing again, and you're going to see eruptions across the place. And I think we're all in danger by that, and it's getting to be it's politicized in such a way that's really even hard to take safety measures without having to defend them. I've had comments about wearing a mask into a grocery store. Not many, but just enough to make me think, really? I'm not wearing this for me, I'm wearing it for you, or I'm wearing it for the people who are in that store, trying to protect them to some extent. I don't even want to be there, but there are things that you have to do. So I think we want to open up because we see the devastation that's happening economically, and we know that could last for a generation if we don't sort of get a handle on that. So there's great pressure to do that, but there's also really, what's the point of having a strong economy if we don't have many people left to do that work that requires that to happen? So all you have to do is look at the countries that around us too that are experiencing this. Look what's happening in Brazil. But it's really difficult. This whole science of just counting coronavirus deaths and cases is difficult, because how do you know? Are they how good is the testing? How good is the tracing? How good is the information about what people should wear or what people should use? I don't think we've had the best information all the time about that kind of thing, and that makes me nervous sometimes too. So I don't know what else to tell you, is that err on the side of caution. And there are voices of caution out there. They're just not very popular.
Oh, Dennis, my concern is when it seems that so many media outlets are purposely make, advertisements or sponsorships look like news stories. And, they purposely confuse people. I know that's part of the clickbait, but what do you tell your students when how to discern those opinion, or either opinion pieces versus a factual news story, or the advertorials that aren't always labeled?
Right. I teach ethics and class. That's a great question. How do you spot information that's obviously sponsored and made to look like news? There are whole news sites that are fake, that are sponsored by somebody else out there that you should watch. I was looking at some news websites that were set up around Montana that really had no original content at all. And I'm wondering, why are they out exist? They're just using automated scraping programs to get all the public records from that community and throwing them up online as if they were news stories. And so I'm thinking, what is the ultimate purpose of this? What are they there for? What do they hope to gain by gaining these audiences? How much digital advertising are they going to draw in? But sponsored content is one of the ethical debates we always have. We talk about that. And one of the things I wanted to show you was a sponsored content piece from the New York Times, from the New York Times brand studio, they call it. And what they're trying to do is get back into the business of designing advertising that they can design and make money on. I don't know, but but the economic history of advertising has been that if you're a big advertiser, you used to go to the newspaper and have them make up the ad, and they used to charge you extra for that, and they would charge you for placement. So they kind of made, got you 2 times on that kind of stuff. Well, now in bigger markets, they're going to professional ad agencies and they're producing that kind of stuff. So what they're not getting nearly as much from advertising they used to get. And digital advertising by itself is really inexpensive to make, and the first one's expensive. The second one, third one, the 100 millionth one that's copied digitally is really cheap. So compared to print advertising, it's really cheap, but it doesn't make you much money. So I think you see in these big news, Washington Post does it too, but they're very careful today to say sponsored content. And there's a label on that, but that stuff is slick, and it is so good. I was going to show you one made by the Japanese embassy, talking about how important U.S.-Japanese relations were. And it was the Capitol, no, it was a Jefferson Memorial with cherry trees and blossom, this huge picture with some words about how this relationship is worthwhile. And it was produced by the Embassy of Japan. And that tells me that that's a government-produced advertisement. They have something they want to get. They want to increase trade. They want to, I'm not saying their goals are not noble or unworthy, but you got to question what is it they want. They're wanting to create good relations. They're wanting to create this feeling of cooperation in return for what? What is the return? That's the question. And if you're a government, you can't make your decision based on just a glossy ad. You have to make your decisions about, what's reciprocity look like? What economists have to say about these kinds of things? So very complicated stories are being boiled down. My favorite one of all time was the Atlantic magazine, and it really blew up in their faces. They did one on Scientology, and they said something about how Scientology has tackled almost all the world's problems, solved all of its questions, and they used the same fonts and they used the same news type that looked just like the Atlantic magazine, and they got a blowback like you wouldn't believe. And so that, even though they had a little tiny thing up there saying sponsored content, people weren't fooled by that. And people saw that you're trying to use the credibility of the news side and give it to advertisers so they can buy on it. I remember even newspapers tried to do this. They'd run these ads with same typeface, same labels, and this little disclaimer that said paid advertisement. And I would get really angry, and I'd talk to the advertising director and say, make them use a different font and make them use a different type style and make that paid advertisement a little bit bigger. There used to be a pretty well-defined wall between news and advertising, but I got to tell you, news organizations are under incredible economic pressure today, the commercial ones. I see a lot of blurred lines that I wouldn't have seen before. Foundations, even nonprofit journalism has to face these kinds of questions. What strings come attached with that foundation support? What is it they want us to do? What are deal breakers for them? So all of those questions, I think, are ones journalists have to examine. What's everybody's motivation here? What do they want from it? And how does it influence or shape that news itself? Big question. Others?
Kim has a question there in the chat. How do you think the ability of citizens to share video instantly has changed news coverage?
Oh, well, I mean, all you have to do is look at the results of this last week. It was a citizen video about George Floyd's death shared by several citizens that made it the biggest story, and I would argue in the world. The international coverage of this has been amazing and astounding, frankly. But that was citizen video. And I think what that has done is really made a change in media. And I tell my students that today, with this little thing that we have in our hands here, everyone can commit an act of journalism. Now, are they going to commit them on a regular basis? And are they going to be credible? And are they going to be trustworthy? I don't know. I think there needs to be people who train to do that. But having some people in the right place, the right time with a camera, and in this case, with many different camera angles, it was kind of amazing. There was a truth in that. That's raised another question for news organizations, though. How are we going to show this citizen video? Should we show it? How are we going to vet it? How are we going to verify it? There's a program, a software application, much like Google's reverse picture search called InVid, and you can put a piece of video in it and they will tell you if it has appeared before. You can put frame by frame and they can say, oh, that wasn't from last week, that was from 1989, or that was from 1995, or that wasn't a protest that was in Iran, that was a protest that was in Bahrain. You can check those kinds of things now if you see the clues. I teach my students how to do video searches, or they know how to do them faster than I do. But looking for Google reverse searches, everybody does that now. And the smart ones right away will tell you, that's not a picture. We've had those cases during this protest stuff. You get pictures of people who said that they were killed, or protesters who said something happened to them. We find out that that's a picture of somebody completely different at another kind of place. And why is that happening? Who's doing that? What are the motivations? You know, that can make your head spin trying to answer those kind of questions. In many cases you can't, but you can at least tell people that isn't the truth.
I had mentioned that I've been really closely involved with following the Denver protests.
Mhm.
When you're talking about video, some of the live streaming video that they're doing do not match from what I'm seeing exactly from the news sources either, and they're in the same location. So that's been very interesting to watch.
Right. I mean, you can play with this stuff, and you don't have to be terribly sophisticated to make this stuff up. But I'll even bring it down to Missoula level just this week. We have protests going on down by the courthouse, and there's been some counter protesters who showed up too, and there hasn't been any real conflict. There hasn't been any sort of violence. It's been almost entirely peaceful. And that to me is the fact that the media is reporting it in that proportion. It seems so smart, and I'm grateful for it. Not blowing up or you know, not making these things more than what they are. But there were online social media stories about this giant group of liberal anti-fascist army that were going to come to Montana to create all these protests and do some damage and violence, and people were turning up saying you should go to your local protest and fight it off. And I haven't seen anybody who's been able to verify any of those social media reports. The Missoula mayor's office and the police say they don't have any intelligence to support it. Missoulian can't find it either. I can't see anything that seems credible to me from those kind of things. I haven't made a full-time job of looking for that kind of stuff, but I would think that if it's true, you're going to see some groups that you can verify, and nobody's been able to verify that stuff. And that was an important sentence or part of a sentence in a news story this week, and that took some critical thinking. Has there been any evidence to support this kind of stuff? And sources I trust tell me there haven't. What can I say?
Yvonne typed a great question into the chat there too. She says, is there no way to regulate a major media source watched by a majority of the population that continually broadcasts misinformation and even promotes people arming themselves? They not only mislead, but undermine, endanger, and threaten the safety of the nation. And that regulation has come up a few times in these conversations. If you could talk about that.
Well, I think it is a great question. A lot of people are talking about it, and I get frustrated by some of that too. But anytime somebody talks about regulating free speech, I get really nervous because I know that's what we really depend on to get all sorts of fuel for democracy. And I can't expect everybody to believe exactly as I do, and know that there are people who are going to have countervailing kind of interests. All I think you can do is fact check. All I think you can do is when you see things that are wrong, you have to say that they're wrong. All I think you can do is really trust people to take a look at that kind of stuff and ask themselves if it's really true. Congress shall make no law, is what the First Amendment says. And that means that the government can't impose restrictions on a free press. There are some very few exceptions, but they're mostly to do with copyright and business sort of relationships. And you may see those get greater, but that was the issue behind the Twitter's just warning that the president's tweets might be untrustworthy. They were getting a lot of blowback, and the president himself was wanting some regulation of Twitter so that we could do that. And I got to think that if that happens, he's going to bear the brunt of whatever happens there too, because his tweets are going to be looked at a lot more skeptically as well. So I mean, shutting people up is one of the courses we just haven't taken. And even though that media is now can go such more quickly and reach such viral sort of audiences, I still think that's an important thing to think about. How are you going to do this in ways? Now, I also think that Facebook and Google and these guys ought to be giving local news organizations money. They're sucking up the advertising. That a lot of this is the air for many journalists today, and I think they ought to be supporting these efforts. But I'm giving you civic online reasoning curriculum that Google helped create. So, I mean, it's not really in their interest to do that other than to say, look, we're doing something about all this bad stuff that goes on our site and this bad stuff that happens. But freedom is a messy business. It really is. And if you're going to live in that, you kind of have to wonder about it. So I think fact checking is kind of the best way to go. And I think we need people who are more literate and able to kind of do that. Now, there's a lot of pushback on just fact checkers too. Oh, they're partisan. Oh, they're just fact checking this guy and not this guy. There's one study that says, you know, because fact checkers can't fact check anything, they really shouldn't fact check anything, because when they put their flag saying this is wrong, that means that everything that they didn't put their flag on is right, and that's not true either. They can't possibly get around to it all. But one study I saw at MIT gave me some hope, and I'm like everybody, I'm looking for rays of hope out there when I see this kind of stuff. And one of them said that if you ask people, he gave people little tests to say, gave them fake news and said, what do you think about this? And they were mostly young people, I'd say under 25, he was looking at this. And he was finding that they were sharing it on a pretty regular sort of basis. And I've done it. I'm guessing most of you have done it at some time. Just about everybody has shared something. They say, oops, I wish I could get that back. And, you know, I'm not sure about that. Maybe those dolphins really weren't in the canals in Venice. You know, maybe that kind of stuff isn't really true. But it said, you know, when you ask people, show them a piece of information, young people, and don't say anything about it, they don't necessarily look at it as if it's something that matters in their lives. Their response is mostly, does it tug an emotion? Does it ring a bell? Does it make you happy? Does it make me sad? Is it something I should share because my friends will find it entertaining? Those are the kind of values that they're taking when they share somebody. So then they tried the same ad with this little disclaimer. Do you think this is true? They just put those words at the top of every question, and the sharing went down dramatically. So I think there are some things that they could do. Do you think this is true? I mean, right there is a flag saying, maybe you ought to check this out before you share it. And that might be something that I think social media organizations want to do. But, you know, they're in the business of large audiences. They make money like you wouldn't believe by getting audiences that you can't imagine to look at things. And, you know, how far are they willing to go? Are they willing to go to sort of make people question whether they should share information on social media? That's my question. I don't think that some of them are willing to go very far at all. Well, Mark Zuckerberg this week said, you know, we are not arbiters of truth. They are. They really are. They do decide what goes on. They do have policies, but they don't want that responsibility as publishers because then they fear that they might really get into some responsibility for regulating that, and that's going to cut into their profits quite a bit. You have to hire news journalists, you have to hire fact checkers, you have to make tough decisions that are going to get you in the crossfires of politics. You're going to have to do all those kinds of things. So I can understand why they don't want to have anything to do with mediating the news. But I mean, to me, that's one of journalists' big jobs today is not only separating fact from fiction, but mediating. You know, getting groups together and saying, how can we look at this? How can we say this is true? What's the proportionate response here? Is it over the top? What are those discussions?
It's too bad because if anybody can afford to hire some fact checkers, it's Facebook.
Yeah, but Facebook can't possibly fact check all the stuff that comes over its site. That was behind the whole Community Decency Act part of the FDA decision in the 90s. They said social media, you can't really be liable for everything that third parties put on your platform. You're just a platform. You're not a publisher. That was the argument. And if you're going to work in that respect, you got millions I'm thinking billions of social media inputs. And now that they can be automated, you can't possibly check them all. Even at your very best, you couldn't possibly do that. So that threatens their very business model right there.
Dennis, this is Yvonne, and I was just kind of wishing that we could have, remember the old Groucho Marx show where whenever anybody said a lie, there was this dead chicken that kind of fell down. I wish we could somehow get that, just to have these chickens fall out of the sky when there's lies. But I was, my anecdote was, I was a year or so ago in Arizona, and it's a very conservative community I was in, and my friend's 98-year-old woman, we kind of avoided politics because I knew we were on the opposite sides, but the last thing she said to me was, those Democrats are going to take away our Social Security. And I thought, where does that, you know, it just
Passed it, yeah.
Yeah, but she, you know, didn't. She's not a media literate person, I guess, as far as exploring and questioning. And
All you have to do is threaten somebody's, you know, existence. And Social Security is so important that any threat, any rumor about a threat is, you know, political parties have made hay on this. Democrats have made hay on this and accusing every Republican candidate of trying to get rid of your Social Security is a pretty good campaign trick if there's something viable behind it, you know. But I have, my parents both live in Arizona too, so I know what you're dealing with. I know it can be tough down there sometimes. It's a scary place to be right now in terms of coronavirus too, because it's one of the places where cases are really rising, and I think it's because there's not really much of a respect for institutional authority or science, you know, and that's something you have to worry about too.
Dennis, I'm going to jump in real quick and say it's almost 5:15. I know we started a little late and we're going a little late. And I think people are still really interested in this conversation, so we can keep going. But I want to say, if anyone does want to jump off at this point, we have some informed citizen programs archived on our website, including one from January when Julie Edwards did a program at the Missoula Public Library and MCAT recorded it. And she spends the entire hour talking about fake news, which you touched on a little bit as part of this. If anyone wants to check that out, that's available. We'll also follow up with an email, and I'll share the slides that Dennis would have liked to have shared, and also a 4-question survey to get some feedback on this. And then with that, if anyone needs to slip out now, that's fine. But today we're going to just keep going a little bit longer.
Sure.
Okay.
As long as they have questions, I mean, that's the best part.
Okay. And then my husband has a question.
Yeah.
It's really hard for me to keep my mouth shut. Sorry.
It's okay.
So I want to talk a little bit more about, you know, this regulation idea, because I come back to that thought process a lot with myself and debating both sides of it. But I guess my question is, you know, when it goes to the level of legislation and political parties, you know, I think of Citizens United as an example of free speech that really sort of redefines free speech to, or not redefines it, but defines it very conveniently for people that have a lot of money to contribute to whatever lobbying efforts or something. There's this really dangerous thing that's happening in our society right now, and where does this regulation, even against sort of our ability to say whatever we want to anybody at any time, as long as we don't threaten their physical, you know, health and well-being, like where does it come to a head?
It even goes to that too, I think.
Yeah, and even when it goes,
that's what makes it so scary, I think, for a lot of people right now. But you know, it is a difficult thing to do. You talked about Citizens United, and I see that Steve Bullock is using it as his campaign ad, saying we need a constitutional amendment, and that's what it would take to overturn the Supreme Court. And changing the Constitution is one of the most difficult things you can do in American politics. It's also one of the most fraught exercises. And frankly, I'm not sure I'd want a convention or unless it was a really targeted amendment to open up the Constitution to have a lot of changes in this political environment. You know, I just think it may be too chaotic. So, I mean, maybe that's a cop-out, but I got to tell you, I think there are some good ideas, but they're always difficult kind of decisions to do. Once you start making a lot of big changes, I happen to agree with that. I happen to think there ought to be a constitutional amendment against Citizens United. I think it's given money it's always had an oversized influence in American politics, but I think it's completely almost obscene now. So I think, that's my opinion. So I think something like that would make sense. If you wanted to change the First Amendment, boy, I'd have to get all my microscopes out, and I'd have to get my network of people watching every word, because we're so jealous of that freedom. And I think people ought to be, and they ought to know that it affects them too. What are you willing to give it up for? Now, sometimes people have given it up for security. Some people have given it up for safety, during times of war. We've muzzled people. We've done all these things, but there's, what price are you going to pay? Privacy? Should that be the reason that we limit press freedom? Boy, I could see Larry agitated over there in that corner right now. I'm getting vibes from former journalists out there. Just talking about this stuff makes us squirm, as it should. No, it's good to talk about though, but it gives people an insight to that amendment number 1 and why it was number 1. It means it's messy. Yeah. Good question though. Other questions? Yeah, Renata?
As we watch the White House press conferences, it just seems like we're watching Saturday Night Live, every day, because they're so chaotic and so much disinformation. And hopefully not many news outlets or press conferences will follow that bad example. But it seems like it's pretty tricky now when you're telling new journalists how to handle such situations. I mean, those of us who've been in journalism haven't had to deal with that too much. But that's, the way that the president just totally insults the journalists when they ask the obvious questions. Have you had much discussion about that with your students? Or?
Well, I kind of like the obvious questions, frankly, myself.
Me too.
They're the ones that they're asked a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
Somebody will know them, but they are the ones. Are you wearing any clothes? Was that emperor's new clothes? It's a great question. Was it obvious? But I think there's been huge debate among journalists, major networks, especially about whether they should cover the president's press conferences live. And some of them, and some big wig commentators have said, just turn it off. Just don't cover them anymore. And that's within their right to do that. They don't have to cover these things. And there's been a raging debate on one side that said, just get rid of it. I think Marina Dowd at the New York Times just said, oh, come on, Jack Dorsey, just shut off Trump's Twitter account. You want to do it. But, you got to think about, what does that mean for Twitter as a viable platform for viable information too? So how is that going to work? The range of the debate has gone from, we should just send people there to watch it and make sure nothing really dramatic happens. Or if it does, they can report that back to us so we can cover that kind of stuff too. But I think there has to be a record. I think there has to be a record of these things. I think you kind of have to bear witness. History is going to demand it, for one thing. So how do you cover these things without making them disproportionately authoritative and important? That is a tough question. I think there's some ways. I don't think you have to cover everything live and verbatim. And in fact, most of the networks stopped doing that a long time ago. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. I know this hasn't been the happiest of happy hours, and I wish you could have seen the funny videos and my slides, but we got to all the content that was in them anyway, and I appreciate your questions for making me remember everything I wanted to talk about one way or the other. So you're a good group. I will share that slide, and we have your emails because you registered for this thing, so that we can get it out there to you. I will also tell you that it's a Google slideshow, and if you read it, sometimes you'll find in the bottom in the notes there are links to things you could look to, and I've showed you some links about this online reasoning curriculum that I'm talking about, are taking just some of their information. I really think that we got to push that in education. And what I'm talking about, middle schools or even younger, people can handle this. I find students are really good at finding things when you tell them there's something wrong with this. See if you can find it. They are really good at finding it. But if you say, just look at this, what do you think about it? They'll just say, oh, this is weird. We should share it. I mean, so you got to ask the question, what is news and what is information if it doesn't matter? Is it just entertainment? What is it? How can you deal with that? So thanks for talking about this topic that's just so important. And so good to see Tangle.
Thank you, Dennis. This was fun.
Thank you.